And, and good morning and welcome. My name is Evan Weiner. I am a journalist. I've been so since 1971 when I was 15 years old, so you don't have to do the math. And here we are again in hello, Chicago from New York. The United States is made up of 50 states, one federal district, and a whole bunch of territories. That encompasses the entire United States. Most people don't realize we have territories as the United States over in the Pacific, whether it be the Mariana Islands or Guam, in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C., which is a federal district. And the territories and the federal district are two separate entities. But in the news this year, Congress talking about allowing Washington, D.C. to become a state and also Puerto Rico to become a state. That would make 52, and the political calculus is not known, except if Washington would come in as a state, it would be two Democratic senators along with one Democratic House member. And that calculus is very important in determining whether or not somebody should come in as a state or not. It's been that way since 1820, maybe even before 1820. The United States and the District of Columbia, it's a federal district. It's not a territory. In 1790, Maryland and Virginia ceded territory to establish the District of Columbia as the capital of the United States. The capital had been floating around. It was in New York and Philadelphia, even Princeton, New Jersey for a little bit. And it was time to establish something. And there was a fight between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton as to how you split up the financial area and the capital of the world, or the capital of the United States at that time. And Hamilton, all you have to do is see the play because he talks about money, 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 money. Hamilton decides, you know what, Thomas, go ahead, go down to the swamp. We don't need the capital of the United States to be here in New York, but you got to let us keep the money here. We want the money here. And the deal was cut. Jefferson would get the capital of the United States closer to his home, Monticello, closer to Georgia. And if you remember, Massachusetts was Maine in those days. So Massachusetts extended up to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And Washington was kind of in the middle, or this area was kind of in the middle. At the time, there were about 3,000 people living in the District of Columbia. White men who owned property in DC would continue to vote either as a Maryland or a Virginia resident, as they had before, but that would change soon. Washington, DC is a federal district, not a territory. Washington residents, about 700,000 of them, live in the city. And it's a much bigger area, especially when you throw in the Baltimore market outside the city limits. Washington residents have more rights than territorial residents, but the federal government calls many of the shots, many of the shots. It limits local power. And Washingtonians don't think that Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or Kevin McCarthy should be setting the budget for local schools, which they do. And there is Washington, D.C., when the Capitol was undergoing some repairs a few years ago. Territories have always been part of the United States. By the act of Congress, the term United States, when used in a geographical sense, means the continental United States, the 48 states, along with Alaska and Hawaii, in territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands of the United States. Washington does not fall into either category. What is a territory? Well, there are 16 territories, some of them inhabited, some of them not inhabited. Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, the US Virgin Islands, and American Samoa are fully inhabited. The rest are not. In Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Virgin Islands, there is citizenship. In American Samoa, it's American nationals. More than 3.5 million Americans cannot vote in presidential elections because they live in one of the 5 territories that has population: Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Guam is a key Pacific military post. And as you will see in history of the United States, many of the territories came into the United States because they were quote unquote key military outposts. Not fully Americans. Those territories are organized. For the most part, they're self-governing, with local elected governors and territorial legislatures. Each has a non-voting member at the House of Representatives. People in the territories cannot vote for the President of the United States, the Vice President, nor do they have full representation in Congress. Let's talk about the district. District of Columbia, the Washington Monument back there. There is a push for statehood, and the push is getting stronger and stronger. In 2019, the Washington, D.C. Admissions Act, introduced by the D.C. delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, in 2019 and 2021, that act was introduced to Congress. You could introduce bills if you are a member, non-voting member of Congress. The bill is designed to grant Washington, D.C. admission into the Union, becoming a state and making it the country's first and only city-state, although back about 50 years ago, Norman Mailer was suggesting why New York City should be a city-state. It's a political battle. The Democrats say, sure, we get 2 senators and we would get a member of the House. The Republicans say, not so fast, not so fast, not so fast. We're not going to get that representation. The political calculus is always in play. DC could tip the balance to the Democrats with 2 senators and 1 House member. The district is about 10 miles. It's too small, according to some. Also, it was carved out by the feds. Joe Manchin, the West Virginia senator, is against statehood because he doesn't think Congress should be involved in statehood. That should be a constitutional amendment approved by 38 states around the country. Except I would like to tell Joe Manchin that all the other states that joined, except the original 13, were not part of the constitutional amendments. Some were torn off other states like West Virginia. Wyoming has 500,000 people. Vermont, 624,000 people. Washington, 700,000. 4 states have fewer than 1 million. 4 other states: Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Delaware. And Washingtonians want statehood. Rights and not rights. Well, there's the Washington Monument undergoing some repairs. In 1801, Congress passed the District of Columbia Organic Act. So we are now talking 220 years ago, which formally placed the government of the District of Columbia under the control of Congress. The act meant that citizens living in the district were no longer the residents of Maryland or Virginia, and as a consequence, no longer had representation in Congress. And it's been pretty much that way since 1801 with some revisions. The 23rd Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in 1961, under which the District of Columbia is treated as a state for the purposes of the presidential election, except it can't have more electoral votes than the state with the least number of electors. That is 3. That's the number 3. 1993, there was a bid for DC statehood, and it was defeated by the Democrats. In the House-controlled Democrats. Democrats controlled the House in 1993 by a 2-to-1 margin. Bill Clinton stayed out of the debate, but he hated seeing this license plate. Taxation without representation. He absolutely hated it. I know people who worked in the White House, and they said when he saw that license plate, it drove him absolutely crazy because he knows it's true. They're paying federal taxes, sure. But they don't want the federal government interfering with day-to-day things like who changes that light bulb when it's broken or who fills that pothole. They don't want the feds saying, oh, this is the X amount of money you get to fill that pothole, but you can't change that light bulb. In schools, we're in charge of the schools. The existing area of the District of Columbia under the Holmes notion would be admitted as the Union's 51st state. The new state would be named Washington Douglas Commonwealth after Frederick Douglass. A new federal district would be created within the boundaries of the new state to be called the capital. The new district would have the White House, the United States Capitol, United States Supreme Court, some federal buildings, monuments such as the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument. I'm not sure if the Jefferson Memorial would be in that area because it's a little south of everything, adjacent to the Capitol and the National Mall. And that would be part of the Capitol, Washington. That area right there would still be the capital of the United States. The John A. Wilson Building is excluded from the Capitol as it would serve as the capital of Washington, D.C. The new state would get 2 members of the Senate and 1 of the House. The current local representatives, and of course that changes, the mayor and the city council would become the governor and the state legislature. The Senate is mulling over whether Washington should be a state. It seems to have a lot of support among the Democrats, except for Joe Manchin, who says people should vote on it, not us. There are people in Washington, D.C. that really do want a state, like 85% of them. Meanwhile, the other territory, or actually this is a territory, Washington's a federal district, it's looking at statehood is San Juan, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a United States territory, yet when it comes to sports, it's an international competitor in the Olympics, complete with teams representing Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, their residents are American citizens. How did America get it? Well, in that war from 1898, remember the Maine, Randolph Hearst decided that he could sell newspapers, as he once almost said, at least he allegedly said, you supply the war, we'll supply the photos to help his newspapers sell newspapers. Spain ceded the island during that war in 1898 as a result of its defeat in the Spanish-American War under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, 1898. The Philippines also went along with Cuba to the United States. San Juan, and there is the citadel overlooking the city. 1917, U.S. granted the citizenship to Puerto Ricans. 19 years later. But it wasn't until the Nationality Act of 1940 that all people born in Puerto Rico were designated citizens by birthright regardless of their parentage. Puerto Ricans served in World War I. Since 1948, Puerto Ricans have elected their own governor. In 1952, a constitution, the Constitution of Puerto Rico, was adopted and ratified by the electorate. And that is overlooking the port of San Juan. Commonwealth status came to Puerto Rico in 1952. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They do have access to Social Security and Medicare, as do the people on the Virgin Islands and in Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, and also American Samoa. Downtown San Juan, what's it like on the streets in downtown San Juan? Well, up until recently, there wasn't a clear majority as to what to do, which meant stay as a state, or become a state, stay as a commonwealth, or go independent. Problem with going independent, and I've done this because I've been on cruise ships in the Caribbean for years and years and years speaking, and the problem is most of those countries are dirt poor and have very little going for it. You could go to Dominique, or you could go to Grenada, and you could see just piles and piles of poverty, not much industry. And in Puerto Rico, they know that for a fact. One of the better islands in terms of wealth is Martinique, and that is a French territory, or French state actually, in the Caribbean. So Puerto Ricans know that it won't be easy to go as an independent, probably better off being a state. The Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act was introduced by the Shadow Congresswoman Soto and the Puerto Rican resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, and that would require Congress to vote on whether to admit Puerto Rico as a state on passage of one final referendum for Puerto Rican voters whether to accept or decline Congress's offer of statehood. There are about 3 million American residents, which is more than 20 states. And the political calculus on this is Puerto Ricans generally vote Republican, but the tide has changed in the last few years. And then if Puerto Rico became a state, it would be 2 Republican senators and maybe up to 4 Republican House of Representative members. So the Democrats are sitting on the fence with this one. They'll take Washington, D.C., but Puerto Rico, it's kind of complicated. So the 3 possibilities are statehood, continuing status quo, which doesn't seem to be working, or independent. But most Caribbean countries are struggling to survive economically. And the Senate and Congress have been very, very slow to react to Puerto Rico's future. They did hold hearings in April about whether or not Puerto Rico should become a state. They held hearings. They heard about the pros and cons, and that's about it. The average resident doesn't seem to know exactly what they want. By November of 2020, in the last referendum, simple question, yes or no? Should Puerto Rico be admitted into the Union immediately or not? 655,505 votes said statehood. 592,671 said no. It's quite a bit. That's 63,000 more saying yes than no, which is the largest in these various referendums, non-binding referendums that Puerto Rico has been having. Meanwhile, over at St. John in the Virgin Islands, there's St. Thomas, St. John, St. Croix, and there's no hurry to become a state. Virgin Islands depended pretty much on tourism. There's some rum, I suppose, there, but it's pretty much a tourism mecca. The United States got the Virgin Islands in 1917, basically because of World War I. Denmark didn't know what to do with them. The World War I started in 1914, and World War I brought the reforms to close and again left the islands. There were reforms. Denmark was reforming the island somewhat, but World War I comes around and the islands are isolated and exposed. And there were some submarines in the area, German submarines in the area. And the United States is beginning to think, this is not good for us. But we're neutral right now, but this is not good for us. We need to do something, because what if Germany seizes the islands and uses the islands as a submarine base? So the Wilson administration, Woodrow Wilson's administration, talked to Denmark and said, we'd like to buy those islands from you. There was some negotiations, selling price, $25 million, about $275 million today. And that was in gold coins. And the United States jumped on the deal and they had the Virgin Islands, not because they wanted the Virgin Islands in terms of tourism, they didn't care about that. They wanted to use it as a military outpost. Again, you'll see a lot of these territories, strategically, they were military outposts. And for people going to the Virgin Islands today, this is what they generally are going for: the palm trees and the beach, and maybe a drink and a little swim, a little sun tanning. That's what the Virgin Islands to most is about, to go there. The deal was finalized January 17th, 1917. The United States and Denmark exchanged their respective treaty ratifications. The United States took possession of the islands March 31st, 1917. The territory renamed overnight the Virgin Islands of the United States. And again, this is generally why people visit the Virgin Islands. In terms of the Virgin Islands and the local population, there's no real push for statehood. The Virgin Islands residents of Virgin Islands thought about, let's think about statehood. And they did in 1984. And there was a 1993 referendum and statehood lost significantly. So there's no push there. Guam. Guam is a very, very interesting island in the Pacific Ocean because By modern day warfare, it's not very far from North Korea, nor is it very far from China. I see intercontinental ballistic missile could be launched at any time and hit Guam real soon. This is where America's day begins. And Guam was one of those Spanish territories that Spain gave up during the Spanish-American War. The United States captured Guam on June 21st, 1898. The Treaty of Paris, signed December 10th, 1898, Spain ceded Guam to the U.S., effective on April 11th, 1889. And the United States had this thing there. Didn't really know what to do with it. Not too many people lived there, but it was a strategic island nonetheless. After World War II, the Guam Organic Act of 1950, after World War II, established Guam as an unincorporated organized territory of the United States, provided the structure of the island's civil government, and granted the people of Guam U.S. citizenship. The governor of Guam was federally appointed until 1968. The Johnson administration changed that. Lyndon Johnson signed the Guam Elected Governor Act into law, and that provided for the office to be elected by the people. Pacific hotspots are nearby, and that's what makes Guam so important. I've never been in Guam. I've been obviously in Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Almost had an opportunity to go to Guam about 6 years ago, but there was a 29-hour plane flight involved, and it didn't seem to be what I wanted to do at the time. It's a military hub. That's why it's there. That's why it's the United States, and the United States protects it and has it. It's a military hub. The Pentagon's plans to relocate thousands of troops stationed on the southern Japanese island of Okinawa to Guam was formulated a couple of years ago. Guam is close to North Korea and China. In 2017, Guam was on the alert for a possible North Korean nuclear attack. Guam is only 30 miles long, 160,000 people, but it's home to a large Air Force base and a naval base. And the locals don't want any more American troops there. They want the Americans to take the troops that were scheduled to be reassigned from Okinawa somewhere else. And people who do go to Guam, palm trees, sand, and water. So what are the options? Well, statehood, give Guam all the rights, also the burdens of being a state, 160,000 people. You take the 4 miles that I'm in here, and you got 160,000 people surrounding me in the 4 miles. Free association with administrative power like Palau or the Marshall Islands, or independence. That can make Guam a minuscule sovereign state, but that may not work. The Northern Mariana Islands are in the same boat as Guam. It's a self-governing commonwealth, 22 islands and inlets in western Pacific Ocean. The Commonwealth is part of the Mariana Islands, which is a chain of volcanic mountain peaks and uplifted coral reefs. The chain also includes the politically separate island of Guam to the south. Again, strategic for the United States militarily to have those islands. The Northern Mariana Islands, or the CNMI, emerged from the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, which the United States administered on behalf of the United Nations, from 1947 until Palau, the last member of the TTPI, chose its own political future and became a political country in 1994. The federal law making CNMI U.S. territory was passed in 1975. That is Saipan, part of the Mariana Islands. The CNMI adopted its constitution in 1977, and its first constitutional government took office in 1978. The CNMI came under federal minimum wage regulations in 2007 and immigration law in 2008. In June of 2009, The CNMI's Immigration and Border Controls were taken over by the Department of Homeland Security. The Northern Mariana Islands do not have voting representation in the US Congress, but since 2009, they have a delegate on the floor of the House of Representatives who can participate in the debate but has no power. And there's no representation in Congress. The other territory with people, American Samoa. This one's a little different because they're not American citizens in American Samoa. American Samoa is an unincorporated, unorganized territory of the United States. The United States has not provided an organic or charter act setting forth a system of government there. The U.S. Secretary of the Interior had jurisdiction over the territory since from 1951 until 1967. American Samoans were given the authority to draft its own constitution. The people are not citizens. They do not have the rights, Social Security, Medicare, that people in the territories have. They are just U.S. nationals, and they can go to other places. There's a big, last time I was in Hawaii, in Honolulu, there was a big batch of homeless people from the Northern Mariana Islands and American Samoa living by Waikiki, and because they were American nationals, Hawaii couldn't do anything about them. The American Samoa territory, deed of secession starting in 1900, would transfer over to the US. The local chiefs of the Tatalua, the largest American Samoa island, ceded the island to the United States in 1900, Manos in 1904, Swain Island in 1925. Authority over American Samoa originally was a US Navy domain, and that was till the United States took over. And that's the United States, or the United States of 50 states. The 48 in the lower part of the continent, or actually it's the middle of the continent. Mexico is lower than that. Hawaii out in the Pacific Ocean, and Alaska in the very north, adjacent to Canada. So how they become states? Well, some territories existed for only a short time, becoming states, while others remained territory for years. The shortest lived territory, the Alabama territory, lasted only 2 years. The New Mexico territory and the Hawaiian territory lasted more than 50 years. And at least to everybody else, with the exception of Joe Manchin, it seemed fairly easy to make a leap from a territory to a state. But then again, Manchin has a point. Washington, D.C. is not a territory, it's a district. The Vermont territory, that's Bennington, Vermont. The Vermont Independent Republic has a rather interesting story because it's not one of the original 13 colonies. It really wasn't a state. Well, let's talk about it a little bit. In the early 1700s, the royal governors of New Hampshire and New York made land grants to settlers in the area, which later became Vermont. The king had to settle the matter of which colony had the right to grant land claims. It was kind of no man's land next to New York. If you look at the New York border now, it's fairly up and down, but the New York border back then extended towards New Hampshire and actually went 10 miles into Connecticut until that was settled, and Connecticut got to 10 miles, pushing the New York border back. New York also had Erie, Pennsylvania, and sold it to, actually it was Erie, New York, but sold it to Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania wanted a port on Lake Ontario. The king ruled in favor of New York, the land that was about ready to become Vermont, although it was popularly known as the New Hampshire Grants. The area all looks the same. In New York, it's the Adirondacks. In Vermont, it's the Green Mountains. In New Hampshire, it's the White Mountains. But basically, that's a picture I took up in Bennington a couple of years ago. All looks the same up there. Adirondacks, Green Mountains, White Mountains. The main reason that Vermont was able to become an independent was they wanted to get rid of being New Yorkers. They didn't want to be New Yorkers. And the Revolutionary War came about. They didn't want any part of New York. And New York said, you know what? I want to go, get out of here. It's all yours. So they decided to become an independent republic. During the Revolution, the American Revolution, Vermont declared independence separately from the original 13 colonies, although the Continental Congress refused to recognize it. There was some thought that Vermont might link up with Quebec and form something. Quebec was having problems with the English, and the English saw the revolution coming and said, okay, you could speak French and you could practice Catholicism. So they wanted them on their side as they knew the revolution was coming. So which side should we be on? Ethan Allen, before he became a furniture store in this area, Ethan Allen and some other like-minded politicians talked to the British in Quebec and said, hey, you know, we might want to join. But the Quebecois said, nah, we're not interested. You speak English there. We want to speak French. They were rebuffed. So Vermont becomes an independent republic. It outlaws slavery, granted everybody the right to vote, all males anyway, not females. In the 13 colonies, it was only landowners. In Vermont, you didn't have to own property. And Vermont issued its own money and operated its own postal service. By 1790, the United States wanted it. They made a deal, and Vermont was admitted to the Union as the 14th state after 14 years of being an independent republic. The Mississippi Territory, there is Biloxi, Mississippi. The Mississippi Territory was created by Congress in 1798. It was a strip of land extending about 100 miles from north to south from the Mississippi River to the Georgia border. Still is that area. The territory was increased in size in 1804 through 1812 to reach Tennessee to the Gulf of Mexico, driving in Alabama. The western part of the state became, or western part of the territory achieved statehood as Mississippi. In 1817, the eastern part of the state, Alabama, 1819. And that behind me is the Louisiana Territory from 2 years ago. It's actually the Mississippi sailing into New Orleans. The Louisiana purchased more than double the United States territory, 1803. Napoleon's fighting his wars, needs all kinds of money, and the United States under the Jefferson administration, Thomas Jefferson, decides, yeah, we want more land, we want more land, we want more land. And they purchase all that area. The Louisiana Territory was organized, incorporated territory of the United States. It existed from July 4th, 1805 to June 4th, 1812, when it was renamed the Missouri Territory because some of the territory became states. Throughout most of the United States history, regions were admitted as U.S. states, but prior to that, territories or parts of territories were territories of this kind. As the United States grew, the most popular parts or populous parts of an organized territory would achieve statehood. Montana was part of that deal. Logan's Pass, that's Glacier National Park in 2015. And that was part of the Louisiana Territory that France claimed. The states, Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and most of the land in Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Minnesota made up the Louisiana Territory. Meanwhile, in Maine, well, that was Massachusetts, except the people in Maine, who were Massachusetts residents at that point, didn't like the people down in Boston enough, and they wanted to get away. Besides, they had no common border. That little border, if you look at the map, there's a 10-mile stretch from southern Maine to northern Massachusetts. That's New Hampshire. So they never connected. And this is political calculus time again, the first time political calculus is really used. 1819. The United States had 11 free states and 11 slave states. And if Missouri came in as a slave state, well, that interrupts the competitive balance. So we got to do something, and we got to do something, we got to do something. Well, hey, those people up in Maine, they don't want to be part of Massachusetts anymore. They want their own state. Missouri Compromise is made. Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state, but would be balanced by the admission of Maine as a free state. And those people want to be separated from Massachusetts. The Florida Territory, that isn't necessarily too far from where the building collapsed yesterday. The territory of Florida was organized as an incorporated territory of the United States. It existed from May 30th, 1822 until March 5th, 1845, when it was admitted to the Union as the state of Florida. That's Jupiter, Florida, and the Jupiter Tower. Originally, it was the Spanish territory of La Florida, and later provinces were added of East and West Florida. It was ceded to the United States by Spain as part of the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty. It was governed by the Florida Territorial Council for a while. Texas, another republic. There was 4 independent republics of the United States that became states. They were Vermont, Texas, California, and Hawaii. Texas has been ruled by many people. Spain, 1519 to 1685, 1690 to 1821. France, 1864 to 1860 for Fort St. Louis. 1803 to 1805, that's French Louisiana. Mexico, 1821 to 1835, the Republic of Texas. 1836 to 1845, since 1845, the state of Texas. The United States, 1845 to 1861. Confederate States of America, 1861 to 65. Back to the United States in 1865. The Republic of Texas was a sovereign state in North America that existed March 2nd, 1836 to February 19th, 1846, although Mexico considered it a rebellious province during its entire existence. James Polk was the guy in the White House who made the land grab for Texas to become a state. That was the Republic of Texas. You can see the outline was down to the Rio Grande, and part of it was in New Mexico, part of it in Oklahoma, part of it in Carolina, and part of it into Wyoming. The 1845 annexation of the Republic of Texas into the United States led to immediate statehood. James Polk wanted to just get rid of the Mexicans. Let's go after them. Polk only served 1 term, totally forgotten as a president, except he brought Texas into the United States. It's admitted into the Union as a 28th state on December 29, 1845. The war, the Mexican War. Mexico loses, cedes its claims to Texas in the Rio Grande border, and it was accepted by both nations in 1848. Oh, San Francisco, my best friend in the National Football League, Jeff Beeren. Here we are at Fisherman's Wharf, November of 2019, in what was the Republic of California. June 14th, 1846, there were about 30 gun-toting Americans that entered Sonoma, a small town in the Mexican territory of Alta California. They were prepared to take the town by force, said they shared brandy with the Colonel Mariano Vallejo, not of the gas stations, of the Mexican army, and he surrendered. For the next 25 days, California was an independent nation, the Republic of California. There's that guy, James Polk. James Polk decides to bring California into the fold. There was a Bear Flag Revolt, which ended the Republic of California, and it was absorbed into the Union. The Californos formally seceded Alta California in 1847 with a treaty. California became a 31st state, or the 31st state, September 9th, 1850. And Polk, who is long forgotten, not too many people ever say James Polk is my favorite president or care about him, made no secret of his desire to annex California. Zachary Taylor or Millard Fillmore at that point was the president of the United States. Oh, and California also had gold. 1848, just before California's formal annexation, gold was discovered in Coloma near Sacramento, Sutter's Mill. The ensuing gold rush transformed California from a region sparsely populated with Hispanics and Native Americans to being totally controlled by white Americans as an economic center. The Oregon Territory. Now, this is a rather interesting story that they never taught you in school. Keep Portland weird. The Webster-Ashbury Treaty of 1842 partially delineated the northeast U.S.-Canadian border, but didn't do anything in the Oregon Territory. Some of it went into what is now Canada, and the Canadians had some claims south of the border. But the Oregon Territory, 1844, all Black people were ordered to get out of the Oregon Territory, which was huge. It went from the Pacific coast to the Rocky Mountains into the northern colonies at that point, because they were northern colonies, Britain. Those African Americans, Negroes, who refused to leave could be severely whipped. The provisional government law declared by not less than 20 or more than 39 stripes to be repeated every 6 months until they left. No one was ever lashed. That is the Columbia River behind me as part of the Lewis and Clark Trail that went out in the early part of the 19th century. The territory of Oregon existed August 14th, 1848 to February 14th, 1859. The southwestern portion of the territory was admitted to the Union as the state of Oregon. The rest of the region was divided by the United Kingdom and the US in 1846. That was obviously before statehood or before the statehood. The area would include parts of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming, and Montana. That is the Oregon State Constitution. And it's an interesting read. In 1859, Oregon became the first and only state to enter the United States that prohibited Blacks from living in the state in its constitution. The exclusion clause was rendered moot by the 14th Amendment to U.S. Constitution. It's repealed by voters in 1926. Other racist language in the Oregon State Constitution was finally removed in 2002. There are some people in Oregon now who want to leave Oregon. They want to join Idaho, along with some people in California. It would take up 70% of the land that Oregon has, only 21% of the population, and doesn't have any big cities that would be economic engines. Idaho, I'm not sure would want them because they have their own money problems. And that's the New Mexico Territory, Arizona, and New Mexico. Territory of Arizona, or rather Territory of New Mexico, was incorporated on September 9th, 1950, and lasted until January 6, 1912, admitted to the Union as the state of New Mexico, making it the longest lived organized incorporated territory of the United States, lasting 62 years. There is Arizona. Still have that sport code. The Arizona Organic Act was an organic act passed by the 37th U.S. Congress on March 12, 1862 by the Representative James M. Ashley of Ohio. The act provided for the creation of the Arizona Territory by division of the New Mexico Territory into two territories along the current boundary between the two states. That is Seattle and Pikes Market up in Seattle. The territory of Washington split from Oregon, March 2nd, 1853 until November 11th, 1899. The territory admitted to the Union as the state of Washington and included the entire modern Idaho and parts of Montana and Wyoming before getting its final boundaries in 1863. Coeur d'Alene in Idaho. The Idaho Territory existed March 3rd, 1863 until July 3rd, 1890. The territory would be admitted to the Union as Idaho. Alaska. And Alaska becomes important during the war, actually, World War II, because there's a place called Whittier that you can't have radar in because there's a constant cloud cover. And a lot of the Air Force, what was the Air Force? Navy ships ended up in Whittier because nobody could track it because it's always in fog. I should know, I was there in 2006. The Russians had Alaska, and they began to worry that US settlers one day would overrun Alaska and they couldn't do anything about it, or they would lose it to Great Britain because they lost the Crimean War to Great Britain. That lasted 1853 to 1856. And the Russians were savaged by debt. Some bald eagles overlooking Sitka, Alaska. On March 30th, 1867, the United States Secretary of State, William H. Seward, signed a treaty with Russia for the purchase of Alaska for $7 million. It was ridiculed, Seward's folly, Seward's icebox, Andrew Johnson's polar bear garden. And that's Sitka, the last Russian capital. That was July 4th, 2017. The territory of Alaska, or the Alaska Territory, an organized incorporated territory of the United States, existed August 24th, 1912 through January 3rd, 1959. Became or joined the Union as the state of Alaska. The territory created as the District of Alaska, May 17th, 1884, and it would be a strategic military outpost. Speaking of strategic military outposts, Oahu. Hawaii, one of the 4 US states, apart from the original 13 to be a territory. The Vermont Republic, the Republic of Texas, the California Republic, all independent nations. Texas and Hawaii had formal international diplomatic recognition as a nation. Hawaiian sunrise outside of Honolulu. There was a coup. The Queen, Liliuokalani, announced plans for a new constitution, 1893. But these American, European business people who saw the sugar and other things in Hawaii said, they form a committee of safety and then staged a coup against the kingdom. And then they went after annexation from the United States. This guy, Sanford B. Dole, was one of the ringleaders. He was an American lawyer. He became the president of the Republic after they somehow beat the Queen and forced the Queen out with their little band. The Provisional Government of Hawaii ended July 4th, 1894. Grover Cleveland's administration said that, hey, wait a minute, the removal of the Queen was illegal. The United States government told their citizens the Queen needs to be reinstated. But Dole and his people, and there weren't very many of them, said, no, we're in charge now. You're only Grover Cleveland, the president of the United States. We don't have to listen to you. Oh, the Waimea Canyon. In 1898, the Republic of Hawaii was annexed by the United States, became the territory of Hawaii because of the sugar interest, the sugar lobby. They wanted to get rid of tariffs so they could easily ship sugar to the mainland and make a lot of money off of it. That's why they knocked off the Queen. The Hawaii Territory existed August 12th, 1898 to August 21st, 1959, when the territory was admitted into the Union as the 50th state, and then officially became the 50th state in 1960. That is my son in front of the McKinley statue in Buffalo, New York, because McKinley, President McKinley, agreed with the Congress to grant Hawaii a popular elected vote after the annexation, which took place under McKinley, an act to provide a government for the territory of Hawaii, or the Hawaiian Organic Act of 1900 established the office of the territorial governor. And they took over the palace. The palace is now the Hawaiian state capital, but it was the guys who knocked off the Queen that kind of liked the palace. In 1900, Hawaii was granted self-governance, retained the Ailani Palace as a territorial capital building. The plantation owners and capitalists maintained control through financial institutions, but they found territorial status convenient because they were able to bring in cheap labor, foreign labor, and immigration and labor practices that were prohibited in other states were allowed in the territories. There would be a non-voting delegation to the United States Congress seated with offices and otherwise usual rights and privileges of a U.S. representative to the House of Representatives. The annexation of Hawaii to the United States made selling agricultural products to the mainland much more profitable. No tariffs. But workers began to discover we have some rights here. You know, you can't just treat us, you just can't treat us poorly. In 1920, there was a multicultural strike, and there were shifting political alliances between 1902 and 1930, which allowed Cuba to have a larger share of the United States sugar market. 45% of the domestic quota, while Hawaii and the Philippines and Puerto Rico shared 25% between them. And then the strategic military outpost, Pearl Harbor, that was coming after the annexation, and the Americans felt that they needed to take care of the Pacific Rim, and they could do it out of Pearl Harbor. And of course, Pearl Harbor was bombed December 7th, 1941, and that started World War II. There was a push for statehood in the 1950s, and it got there. In 1993, the U.S. Congress passed a joint apology resolution regarding the overthrow, signed into law by Bill Clinton. The resolution apologized for the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom and acknowledged that the U.S. had taken Hawaii unlawfully. Not that it does any good now because Hawaii is a state. There is some push for Hawaiian independence, but not really all that much. And that was me with Governor of Hawaii, Linda Lingle, in 2005. The territories that do not exist anymore. Panama, that's Colon, Panama, a city that looks like it has been left behind in absolute desolation since the United States got out of there. The former territories, Cuba, the shortest on the list in terms of length, 4 years, 1898 to 1902. The Panama Canal Zone, 1904 to 1976 in the Philippines. 1898 to 1946. Humboldt Glacier, that's in Alaska. The last territories to become states, Alaska and Hawaii. Washington, D.C. has statehood advocates. On November 8th, 2016, D.C. residents voted overwhelmingly in favor of statehood. 86% of the voters said, let's go. The district's future could really be determined soon by the Senate if Joe Manchin decides we don't need a constitutional amendment to allow Washington to become a state. Puerto Rico's future status is much more blurry. It's going to be debated. None of the other territories want statehood. And so that's where we stand as of today. The last hearing in the Senate was on April 14th, and that was about Puerto Rico. And Washington is putting more and more and more pressure on everybody to see it their way, make us a state. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me. Any questions or any comments? The floor is all yours.
Well,
Very
thank you
interesting.
very much. Thank you.
Bill, okay. Any questions about statehood? Would you vote for a Washington, D.C. statehood if you had a constitutional amendment in front of you?
No,
I would.
You would? Bill would. Why would you do it?
it's not that big of a territory. It's only 10 miles, right?
Yeah, but it's got more people than 4 other states.
Well, then they would have to admit Diego Garcia, would they?
I don't know. No, but they're pushing. They're pushing. And Washington has industry. It's not like Washington doesn't have anything. You know, they do have industry there. And it's a, you know, in part of a big area. But the question is, should the federal government be the ones in charge of the budgets? And that's the big problem.
Not enough information for me to vote on.
So, yeah, so that's the big problem down there. But they don't want the feds to tell them, this is your budget for schools. They want their school districts, they want their water department, they want their garbage collection. They want to be in charge of it. They don't want Schumer or McConnell or Pelosi or McCarthy in charge of their budget, and that's their point.
Very interesting.
Yes,
Thank you.
curious,
Excuse me?
curious, because if, say the District of Columbia becomes a state,
Yeah.
and I don't think they have the economic base to support themselves.
Oh, they do.
They do?
They do. Yeah, they do. Have you been in Washington lately?
Nope.
Oh, they do. Washington does not look like Washington of the 1960s. The Metro has entirely changed the city. So they could stand on their own as a city state. They got more people. How's Delaware? Delaware is the smallest state. Well, Delaware is where companies incorporate, right? You look at some of the states, what do they have? Washington's part of that I-95 corridor. They do have enough there to take care of things. And again, they feel they're entitled to run their own house. And you take out the federal buildings, how many people live in that little district? They would still have over 700,000 people there. Washington has changed. It has totally changed over the last 20 years, 25 years. People have moved out and people have moved in. It's got big tech area now, and it's got schools, and it's got a lot of services. So they have transformed thanks to the Metro. When there was no Metro there, you couldn't get around. City is totally different now.
Interesting.
We went,
Anyway, but you may never get a chance to vote on it. So, deals could be worked out in Congress that would allow it. But, again, a lot of territories became states because strategically it was good for the United States in terms of whether it's taking over territory or taking over an area militarily like Guam, or it has resources. So Washington doesn't have the resources. Puerto Rico, that's where a lot of pharmaceuticals are made. And Guam, of course, is right there with China and North Korea.
So are the pharmaceuticals still in Puerto Rico, or have they moved out?
Yeah, a lot of them still are.
Okay. So why couldn't the state of the Washington House, our capital, be moved to Kansas? That would be
It could.
centralized whole thing.
It could if somebody wanted to do it, I suppose, but there's a lot of investment in Washington, so I doubt that they would want to move it. And listen, that area goes from Lincoln Memorial to the Capitol. On this side, the White House to the Smithsonian. It's that, and everything is there. If you're going in Anacostia, Anacostia has nothing to do with the Capitol area. And the people say in Anacostia, well, why aren't we in control of what they do? I mean, most projects that's built in DC have to get the federal government approval. And their thing is, we don't want who's in charge of the government. We want our own local planning boards to say this is okay and that's not okay.
Okay. Thank you again for your history lessons.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Great job, Evan.
Thank you. Thank you. So we will see you next week. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Am I doing Washington and Barbados next week? Before the
I
55?
think next week is 1963.
1963. Okay. All right. So we will see you. Same bat time, same bat station next week. Everybody have a good weekend. Stay dry today. And I recorded this. I'll send it to you. Let me stop recording this.
Thank you.
And